Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 21. And today I'm joined by Alex Frankel, who is the PM for Microsoft Azure ARM template deployments and blueprints, and is also the maintainer of Bicep. And it's Bicep that we are going to be chatting about today. Something I've been using recently for a few projects and I'm loving it. So welcome to the show, Alex.
Hey Dan, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome. So before we jump into Bicep, I'm going to do a couple of listener social media mentions. And the first one goes to Alistair Smith, who tweeted out, after hearing Chris Sainty on Draken's Unhandled Exception podcast talking about Blazor, I'm now evaluating this for the new project I'm starting. First time listening, check it out. So thank you, Alistair, for the tweet. First time listening, but hopefully not the last. And then the second one goes to Clifford Agius, who's tweeted, just listened to Mark Grendel on Draken's awesome Unhandled Exception podcast. As always with Mark, it's funny and goes on all sorts of tangents. I like the headspace idea as well. I'm going to give that a try. Thanks, Cliff. Yes, the episode certainly did have the odd tangent or three. Really enjoyed recording it and I'm glad you enjoyed listening. Now, for those that don't know Cliff, he's actually fairly well known in the UK .NET speaker community and he's also a pilot, coding away whilst the autopilot does its thing, I believe. Don't mean to scare anyone then. So thank you both for your tweets. And so Alex, let's jump into Bicep.
Let's do it.
We should start at the beginning on what is Bicep.
Yeah, so Bicep at the highest level, and your audience will have a good understanding and appreciation for this sort of thing, is it's a transpiler. So all it does is take your Bicep code and turn it into ARM template code. And if you have no idea what an ARM template is the kind of native infrastructure as code language for Azure. So if you're deploying resources in Azure, you have a sea of options. One of the many good options that you have is ARM templates, which have been traditionally hard to author, but give you a lot of kind of power in terms of exposing you to what's possible in Azure. And so with Bicep, basically the mission was to just make the authoring experience better. And the best way to do that is just to have a new syntax, but transpile to ARM template JSON so that you get all the benefits of ARM templates without the challenges of authoring.
So I must admit, in the past when I've looked at ARM templates, I've run away screaming. In my head, when I first looked at it, I saw this really bloated JSON, which was really hard to read. And then it was that kind of pushed me away to alternatives. So things like Terraform, for example. So I was kind of like using Terraform for quite a while. And then Bicep came about and you're saying it's transpiling to ARM templates, but it's just so much cleaner. So I guess one example from my experience looking at it is looking at the JSON in ARM templates if you're doing parameters. And it's quite a horrible syntax where in Bicep, it's almost like code where you're just referencing it by dot, then the parameter name.
Right. So, I mean, the context on that is, this is a bit of a misnomer, right? Is that with Bicep, we invented a new language. And really what we did was we took the ARM template language and put it in its own file type, essentially. Because the ARM template language is in a JSON file. It just has to be kind of embedded in these strings. That's how we had to do it, right? So that's why in the JSON, it's double quote and then open bracket, which means that this is going to be an ARM expression. And then as soon as you do the open bracket, you're in ARM template land. You're no longer in JSON land, you're in ARM template land. And we had to just come up with basically syntaxes that would work inside of JSON. And that's where all of our fundamental limitations were hit. So now by extracting it out into its own syntax, we really are treating it like a real programming language. So we've always had the runtime programming language, but we've just never had a real syntax and a real language authoring experience. And so that's why we now have all this opportunity to make it easier and make the syntax right or more appropriate.
I should probably take a step back and be fair to ARM. I guess my first experience was when going to the Azure portal and going to a resource and saying export ARM. Because you get so much back, more than you actually need, probably in the ARM template that would go into source control, that was probably another thing that scared me off, where actually if I had learned it properly, I would have learned, which me learning Bicep now has kind of taught me that a lot of that isn't required properties.
Right. It's still our fault, right? Because we put you on that path of like thinking that I can just export anything, which is a nice feature, but it's a really rough way to expose yourself to ARM templates for the first time. I mean, literally, when I first learned about ARM templates and was, figuring out how to use them, I did the same thing. I went to export and I was like, oh my God, this is what it is. So I didn't have the luxury of running away. If I had, I probably would have. But yeah, exactly. Once you get past that first layer of like okay, I'm declaring some resources. The resources have bodies. I need to give some properties. It's not so complicated. It's just all of that extra goo of like properties that have default values or are read-only properties and they never should have been exported in the first place, and all that kind of garbage. At least with Bicep, we're able to revisit what your learning path is and how we teach you the language and all that sorts of thing that we didn't really have in the same way with ARM templates.
I'll tell you one thing I do love moving away from alternatives like Terraform is just the lack of also having the concept of a state file.
Yeah, yeah.
The one thing I really didn't like was having three sources of truth, I guess is the best way of saying it. So having
exactly
configuration files which you put in Git, the real environment, which is in Azure, but then this stuff in the middle.
Right.
So three sources of truth. From anyone that's used source control before, when you get three sources of truth, that's where you get merge conflicts.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It is a nice benefit. I mean, I sometimes joke that Azure is like a many $billion state machine, right? I can pull the state from Azure at any point and get the real running environment. And as a result, we don't need to manage a state in the way that some of the alternatives do.
I guess in fairness to the alternatives, because, for example, Terraform, Azure is just one provider.
Right.
Terraform files can deploy to Azure, AWS, but also things like Cloudflare.
Yep.
So I suppose if you're writing stuff that talks to all of these things, then maybe that is a good choice and you can understand why they need the state file. But I guess if you're just talking to Azure.
Yeah, so I can give you a sneak peek into what is coming in Bicep's future to an extent. We think we can do some of those things still without a state file.
Ooh.
Basically, what we want with Bicep is to allow you to complete these end-to-end scenarios on Azure. That's really, at the end of the day, our goal. And in most scenarios, you need to create AD principals and assign them permissions. Maybe you need to create a group, and then you need to deploy your infrastructure, maybe with those identities. And then you usually need to do something in what we sometimes call the data plane, where you need to deploy the files to your website, or you need to add some data to a storage account, and so on. And so we do want to implement something to help you accomplish that whole end-to-end in Bicep, but still make sure that you don't need a state file and that we are a transparent abstraction and all that sort of good stuff.
Really nice. Another thing I like is the VS Code extension.
Yep.
That is one of the things that whilst I was playing around with Bicep, that's kind of the thing that pretty much sold it for me, really. And I actually only learned yesterday that it's got snippet support, but even things like linting and telesense and F12 to navigate between things. But yeah, I didn't know that. Well, there was a few things actually, just doing a bit of research yesterday, catching up, and that I didn't know existed, like the visualizer I didn't know was a thing. And there's snippets where so I was playing around doing res hyphen choose some resource tab, and boom, it's there.
Yep. And now we have a way to take open source contributions of those snippets, which is really nice. We haven't really had that before. But let me actually wax on poetically about the VS Code extension, because I think there's some interesting stuff to talk about there, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when we started looking at the landscape of ARM templates, right? So Bicep was not a thing, and we wanted to make ARM templates better. So one of the things that's I think a misnomer, or a mind share kind of discrepancy with ARM templates is that even though they're ugly and hard to use and blah, 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 they're extremely widely used. So by far, it's the most popular declarative tool for deploying to Azure. So declarative tools are templates and Terraform and Farmer and whatever. ARM templates by far are the most widely used. And so we were like, okay, how can we just make the current experience as good as possible? And there was this existing ARM templates VS Code extension called ARM Tools, which we kind of partied on for about a year. We added syntax highlighting to it. We added more IntelliSense to it. But the writing was on the wall that we were only going to be able to do so much because the fundamental syntax was just challenging. With Bicep, And we got some really good advice from the very beginning that if you're going to make a language, there are some things that you really need to focus on and get right. And one of those things is making sure that one, your compiler code and your tooling, your VS Code extension or your language service are one code base. So that's true of Bicep. It's all just one code base. And that when you're creating tooling for languages, it needs to be able to fail gracefully, and it needs to be able to deliver a great experience no matter what state your file is in. And any great language works this way, C#, TypeScript, and so on. You need to be able to parse just a line and know that it's wrong and move on to the next line and parse it correctly. And that ultimately is actually the hardest part of creating a language, is getting it to fail gracefully like that. But anyway, all of that is to say that we paid a ton of attention to the tooling. And that's really the thing we're most focused on, is making sure that your authoring experience feels like a programming language, because to be frank, it's built just like a programming language. It's built just like C# and TypeScript, because we happen to have a guy named Anders Heilsberg who has been able to consult with us and give us good guidance on how to do some of these things.
Well, you've definitely done a good job, because obviously I'm a programmer, and when I'm using it in VS Code, even though it's infrastructure as code, so it's kind of declarative, and you've basically got resource blocks, it still feels like a programming language in the sense of you can declare variables. When you do dot, you get really nice IntelliSense. You get the linting for squigglies. You've got the F12 to go to definition. It feels like you're still programming, and it's just a really, really nice experience.
I think one of the things that we've realized more and more as we've been building out Bicep is that decision to build it like a programming language is something that's really separating us from the other declarative languages that are out there, is that the tooling was a secondary thought in most of these declarative languages. It was like, let's have a simple config language. It'll be easy to write. You can do it in Notepad++, but inevitably these things get more and more complicated. And as soon as you have expressions and variables and references and all these sorts of things, it's a programming language. You can call it whatever you want, but it's a programming language. And so it really needs to be built like one. The decision to do that in Bicep, and the team's not my ability, but the engineering team's ability to execute on that vision is why the tooling has been so good, basically.
Do you think that this might become even more like a programming language? Because I guess another alternative, which we've not mentioned, Pulumi, which is doing infrastructure as code, and you are actually writing code. Do you see Bicep as being what it is now, or do you see it going further down this programming language route?
I think we're open to a lot of different things. I think that where we see ourselves in the larger landscape is like, we're all playing around. We're not sure where all of this is going to land. And so it's good to have Bicep. It's good to have Farmer. I know, you've had Isaac on the podcast. His Farmer project is a really interesting approach where it still compiles into an ARM template, just like with Bicep. And then all the way at the end of that extreme is something like Pulumi, where you're using quote unquote real code. We can talk about what is real code, but you're using imperative languages to describe your infrastructure. And the analogy I sometimes use is like, with infrastructure as code, we're somewhere between like HTML, CSS, JavaScript in the 90s of web programming and React. Like, we're not at React yet for sure, but we're somewhere in between those two things. And so there are going to continue to be experiments, and people are going to try, this with a twist or that with a twist. And ultimately it will get us to whatever is nirvana for infrastructure as code, but we're just kind of playing in that space. So that's a long way of answering, like, yeah, Bicep could evolve to work differently in certain ways where appropriate.
You just made me think, this is a bit of a tangent, but before we started recording, I mentioned the DDD conferences, and there's one, DDD Reading, which is coming up, and they're just about to open a call for talks. And actually, me and three others have been planning doing an infrastructure as code talk where I was going to talk about Bicep, like in the same talk.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to do Bicep, someone else was going to do Pulumi, someone else was going to do Terraform, and then someone else was going to do the intro and mediate it. And I'm just thinking now that, obviously that's a talk we were submitting that would have to get voted for if we end up doing it. But adding Farmer to that would be really interesting.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah. So the Farmer approach is really interesting as well, right? Because you're using imperative code, functional code in this case, to get your deployment binary, which is an ARM template, as opposed to Pulumi, which is doing all the API calls for you. So they are the runtime that's actually going to deploy resources for you. Farmer is not going to deploy resources for you. It's in a sense a transpiler similar to Bicep, where it offloads that responsibility to something lower in the stack, which we think is kind of the right way to do it. On AWS, there's something called the CDK, the Cloud Development Kit. Farmer is more like the CDK than anything else, in that the CDK allows you to describe your CloudFormation templates in a higher level programming language, but ultimately you're still deploying CloudFormation at the end of the day. So it's good. It's great that there's so much experimentation and so many people trying so many different things.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the aims for the talk that we're doing, if it gets picked, is that rather than saying you should be using this, you should be using that, each of us will show how each of the different solutions work so that the audience can actually choose themselves, like look at the pros and cons, see examples of them working, and then just understand all the different options they have.
Yeah, exactly. I think, selfishly, we want people to understand Azure better. The better you understand Azure, the more you'll get out of Terraform or Pulumi or Farmer or Bicep, right? I think one of the things that we're doing well with Bicep is teaching you the platform in a way that is much easier to understand. It doesn't look like cryptic code. It understands, okay, this is a resource. This is the type of resource that I want. Here are the properties that it needs. And it all kind of fits in a way that I can grok.
So I guess that goes back to the visualizer. So sticking with the VS Code extension for a bit, as I say, I only learned that there was a visualizer yesterday, but I've been playing around with Bicep for quite a few months. But my Bicep files I've got they're broken down into different modules, which I'm sure we can come to later. So I found I could right click and visualize a single Bicep file. But is there any way to visualize your whole, all of your Bicep files together? Because I think going back to what you were saying about being able to see how your Azure architecture fits together, if I could do that and see how they're all referencing each other in a graph, I think that would be amazing.
I think it works. I think today, if you go to your entry point Bicep file and visualize it, it should find all the modules and explode all of that together. And it'll draw, diagrams around the module itself. It understands that it's a module.
I'm going to try that right now, because when I tried it this morning, I had kids interrupting me. So I had about 30 seconds to try it maybe. So if I go to...
Pick your most complicated one.
I think the problem is, and this is one thing I'm planning on changing, is at the moment, I've got it broken down into quite a few different Azure pipelines for each individual thing, where I'm aware that this probably isn't great, because at the moment, if I'm redeploying the entire architecture to a brand new environment in Azure, say QA environment, then I've got to manually know what order to run my Azure DevOps pipelines. So I've been thinking about moving it into just one deployment. So I suppose that would help. I have got another project, which I'm not sure if I'm doing the same. Am I doing the same in this project, which is also using Bicep? Oh, this might be a better one. Yeah, let's look at this one. Open Visualizer. Am I about to get really excited?
I hope so, or it's going to break and I'm going to be upset. If you just open VS Code and the language server is still starting, the visualizer sometimes gets out of sync.
Oh, it's worked.
So you may need it did work?
It did. Yes, it was just the language server popping up. So now I can see... Oh, that's nice. I do apologize to the listeners who can't actually see it, but maybe I will include a screenshot if there's nothing too client sensitive in the show notes. But that is quite nice, because I can basically see all the different modules, I think they are, in groups, and then I can see all the resources inside each one, and then I can see arrows pointing to which ones are dependent on which other ones. That's really nice.
And I think the beauty of something like the visualizer, and I talked earlier about the benefits of treating Bicep and building it like a real programming language, is these language services, when they're parsing your code, they're turning it into whatever the syntax is. And the syntax is just window dressing. It can be anything. It turns it into a semantic model, which is like what you actually understand about the things that are being declared in the programming language. Once you have the semantic model, you can visualize that. You can do diagnostics off of that. You can do a million different things. And so the visualizer is just basically us outputting what we already understood about your file. And so we didn't have to do complex extra parsing or anything like that to extract out this information, which, by the way, would have been like a bug-ridden disaster. We just use the information that we have. And so more things like that just continue to fall out, basically. It's not quite that simple, and there's a lot of work that goes into something like the visualizer, but the starting point is so much higher in terms of quality than it was with ARM templates.
Yeah, I guess having that natural dependencies on things. So, for example, app services depend on app service plans, or SQL databases depend on SQL servers. And just having it's almost like naturally a graph kind of hierarchy anyway.
Yep, that's how we're able to do automatic dependency management, right? So it used to be in ARM templates that you had to say, for the listeners that have never gone through the pain of authoring ARM templates, you had to manually say, do this, then do that. You had to get the order right. Things would deploy in parallel by default with ARM templates, but if there was a dependency like that, you had to know about it. And it was a very common source of understandable errors, because you would think that, oh, don't you already understand these relationships? But we didn't. And so with Bicep, we understand those relationships and have just eliminated a huge class of errors as a result.
So is this the thing where in ARM templates you've got to put the depends on and then manually list what the dependencies are, where in Bicep files, if you're referencing another resource, then Bicep infers that for you?
Yep, exactly. Those symbolic names of these resources, these variables, if anytime those symbols are referenced, we know that there's a dependency, implicit dependency there. And so when we emit the ARM template, we emit with that depends on information already baked into it.
So I guess for the listeners, obviously this is an audio podcast. If you've not seen Bicep, I'm just looking at a file now, and a general resource looks like it's got the resource keyword, and then it's got a name, which Alex was referring to as the symbolic name. But this is, from a developer point of view, almost like a variable name. It can be anything you want. And then it's got, in a string, it's kind of like the ARM type, which is version with a date, but that's kind of comes from ARM. And then you've got almost JSON-like block with all the properties in. But then that variable name, like in a coding language, you can use that variable name elsewhere in the Bicep file, and then that's where you get the .IntelliSense, which is really nice.
Yep, exactly. That has been the biggest, like, having those symbols just makes everything work, basically. Because ultimately, with ARM templates or any of these infrastructure as code tools, you're declaring a bunch of resources and you're wiring the resources together and pulling arbitrary properties from one to wire it to another. And that was always like a pretty painful exercise in ARM templates. One, to know what the properties are, because you wouldn't have IntelliSense, but also validating that the wiring is basically done correctly, and then getting the dependencies and the execution graph order correct was all an exercise to the ARM template author. And now, it really just falls out. It's very natural. You can get into kind of like a flow state with Bicep pretty quickly.
That's really cool. So we've mentioned modules a few times.
Yeah.
Can we describe what modules are?
So a module is simply a reference to another Bicep file, which can deploy 0 or more resources. So this is another thing in ARM templates. The second you wanted to break your code down into multiple files, just for pure sanity's sake, the reason that we've been breaking things down in programming for 30 plus years, you want to have small files that are easily understood and easy to debug and test and so on. That was really hard to do in ARM templates. And that alone would drive people away from ARM templates. And in Bicep, as simple as it sounds, it's just a good way of breaking down your project into multiple files, and it'll feel like modules in Terraform or modules in TypeScript. It'll feel like any other kind of multi-file programming paradigm.
Yeah, it's very useful. I'm looking at one of my projects where I'm using modules, but one of them I've got, for example, an API template.bicep. And in this architecture, we've got quite a few different app services, so APIs. And I've got a resource for the web app. I've got a resource basically setting up the firewall rules, and all within this API template, a resource setting up the RBAC permissions, a resource setting up VNet integration. And all of these are in this API template. And these are a pattern that all the different app services follow. And then I've got another Bicep file just called APIs. And then it's literally a small block for each API, which is referencing this module. So for a developer, think about it as a class, a utility class, which knows how to create app services. But in this APIs.bicep, I've just got very short, succinct blocks where I'm passing in a few parameters like the resource name, a few things that are different about each of the APIs. And it's just to add another API now, which has all of these VNet integration and all the different things I was talking about. I just copy and paste this block, just duplicate that block, and change a few of the property names, the parameters, and that's it. So just being able to encapsulate this, it's just massive. Is there any way that, so at the moment, the modules are in the same Git repository as the Bicep files that are using it. Is there a way that we can share these modules?
Not today, but so Bicep is currently in an 0.4 release, and we're working on our 0.5 release. The main thing, like 0.5 will not ship until there's a module registry or a module sharing story. We're going to provide both like a public registry of known good modules, which you think about like deploying a VM. If you've done it in the Azure portal, it's very on Rails. You only get exposed to a certain set of parameters, and a lot of it is defaulted for you. You can think of the public registry as offering some of those sorts of things, like a nicer interface to like a simple VM and some of those things. So Microsoft will maintain those and make sure they're of good quality and whatnot. And then we'll offer the ability to have private registries if you want to keep that within an organization, or if you want to stand up your own public registry, you'll be able to do that as well and offer that to everybody. I think the ecosystem really could start to explode once we have that, and I think we're pretty excited at the potential that will provide.
That'll be really nice. As you say, you can picture a big community around building these different modules. What would that actually look like then? Would a module that's shared still be a Bicep file, or would it be compiled down beforehand?
A DLL? Yeah. So exactly. So with Bicep, what's going to be in the module registry is kind of like a special JSON. So it will be an ARM template with extra metadata to preserve all of the type information. So it is more of like a deployment binary at that point, or like the equivalent of a DLL at that point. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. So does that kind of like, I'm just thinking things like Git and Docker and that kind of thing, where you've got a concept of you're building something, then you push it to a registry and then someone else can pull it. Is it that same kind of concept?
Yep, exactly. So we're going to add a few new commands to the Bicep CLI. There'll be Bicep push, which will compile your modules, turn it into that JSON file, and put it into the registry that you have configured. And then there's going to be, these names are not final, by the way, but then there's going to be Bicep restore, which will pull in all of your references and cache them locally.
That's pretty cool. I was just guessing when I said push and pull, and you said that's potentially what it's going to be.
Yeah. We'll see. Everyone gets opinionated when it comes to these sorts of names, so we'll see what ends up happening.
Yeah, it almost sounded like I knew what I was talking about. It was just a guess, but
secret intel you had.
So I noticed that when in the Bicep stuff I've done, that there seems to be two modes of, or two scopes of deployment, like deploying to a resource group, which is kind of what I'm doing at the moment, but you can also deploy to an entire subscription.
Yes, exactly. So there's actually 4 scopes of Azure. So outside of Bicep or ARM templates, there's the resource group scope, like you said, the subscription scope, like you said. So resource groups live under a subscription scope. There's also the management group scope, which allows you to group subscriptions together, and you can actually parent management groups inside of other management groups. And then there's actually the tenant scope. So when you create a new management group, it lives at the scope of the entire tenant. And Bicep lets you deploy to all 4 scopes.
You actually preempted one of my next questions, where the stuff I've done so far, I've not had to deploy any Azure AD stuff, which is obviously in that final scope you mentioned, outside the resource groups or subscriptions. So that's good to know. We can still do Azure AD stuff as well, like app registrations, that kind of thing.
You can do like role assignments and role definitions and those sorts of things.
Very cool. So I think I've just gone with the default type of deployment, which when I do the deployment, it's saying it's doing an incremental update. Mm-hmm. And I believe you've got full versus incremental?
Complete versus
Complete.
incremental. Yeah.
What would you normally recommend? Because presumably with the incremental, is there any way to delete resources?
There's not. We recommend incremental mode and we don't recommend complete mode. And there's a little bit of history there. For a while in Azure, you could only deploy your templates to a resource group scope. So if you look in especially older pipelines, you'll see there's like a command to create the resource group and then a separate command to deploy a template to that resource group. And that's when complete mode was invented to say that basically, if a resource is not represented in the template, but it is in the resource group, that is, in theory, an indication that you want to delete the resource. The problem is that complete mode was not really considered beyond the resource group scope. So the second you get into kind of multi-resource group deployments, complete mode kind of doesn't work anymore. And so what we're actually doing, there's a thing that we're working on called deployment stacks that will allow you to basically it's complete mode v2. It will allow you to delete resources natively with Bicep or ARM templates, but it's going to be a much more coherent kind of management story no matter how big or small your deployments are. We have a couple public like YouTube talks going into like the API details of deployment stacks. And so we're all like chomping at the bit to start the private preview.
More reading for me.
Yeah. There's a lot going on.
Very, very cool. So another thing I quite liked in this was obviously it's recommended that secrets are stored in something like Key Vault. And playing around, it looks like there's this, I don't know whether attribute is the right word, but when you're doing parameters, you can do @secure. Is it secure?
Yep, @secure. We call those decorators, but I think a lot of people have different terms for those.
Yeah, and it looks like from what I've been doing, it looks like you can literally just in the code that calls into the module, is it just get secret and give it the secret name, and it just does all the magic for you.
Yep, that was a really nice addition. So that's something that you could do in ARM templates with nested deployments, but it was a little tricky to do all of that. And so the get secret function is a really welcome addition. And that was actually an external contribution. And that's been amazing to us. I mean, Bicep is an open source project. I don't know if we explicitly said it because I guess it's like table stakes these days for these sorts of things. But this is our first like real endeavor on our team with an open source project. And to see the community kind of take it up and help each other troubleshoot and actually submit feature PRs like that get secret function is just like totally mind blowing to us. And it's been really awesome to see.
I didn't know that was like a community contribution. One thing I quite like is I noticed recently that the Microsoft Learn has now got a learning path on Bicep as well.
Yeah, and it's really thorough. So the team over there, the documentation team that's been doing Microsoft Learn has just been knocking it out of the park. And there's so much Bicep content already. And there's a lot more planned that they're going to release there.
One question I do have, and I might actually be using this podcast recording to answer my own things that
That's fine. That's cool.
I hope the listeners don't mind. But is there any way to parameters going to a module? Is there any way to pass in an actual resource rather than a string or an int or that kind of thing?
Yeah, so let's give context for those that don't know what we're talking about. But the short answer is yes, eventually, but not today. So today, when you declare a module, you have to declare the parameters that you pass into a module, and those parameters can only be one of the primitive types. So string, int, object, array, etc., or Boolean. And at that point, you've given up your type information of what you are passing in. It could be a resource. And so then you have to replace that with an object and you lose type information. Or it could be a property of a resource. So you can imagine like vm.skews being a type that you want to pass in and validate properly and so on. So that's one of the big gaps that I think we're very eager to close is to, one, allow you to pass resources into a module or output a resource from a module and preserve the type information, but also to do individual properties and really have the same story there. Basically, we have the foundations of a really thorough type system. It shares a lot of DNA with TypeScript's type system, but we haven't exposed all of that to end users yet. So there's a lot that we will continue to expose and be able to validate more and more and more in the editor.
Yeah, that'd be really nice because I guess I don't want to say pain point because that's too strong a word, but it is one of the things where numerous times I've found myself wanting. Like, for example, going back to that API template, inside that, I'm getting an App Insights resource and I'm using the existing syntax. So for the listeners, when you're doing a resource definition, as we described before, you can tag it with existing, and rather than creating a new one, it's just getting a reference for an existing resource. So I'm kind of passing in an ID or name as a parameter just so I can do that existing to look it up. When actually, if the Bicep file that calls the module can just pass in the resource to the App Insights itself,
Yeah.
that would save me having to do that.
Exactly. That's all ceremony and boilerplate at that point. So we definitely want to get rid of that. And it'll make the tooling experience so much better, right? Because then you can do dot property access in the module by just passing the reference to it. So I think the other thing that I got a big education on was the value of the type system and type safety, and how much really it's just about improving the editor experience and the validation experience. And so now, like, we're just always looking out for features where we can add more type safety, more validation, and that's a big one. And I think it's going to be like night and day before that's released and after that's released. It's just going to really change the powerful capabilities of Bicep and really put it at your fingertips.
With the validation stuff, just from a linting perspective in VS Code, if I've got like a variable that's not being used, I get the squigglies telling me that. If I've got a parameter that's not being used, or it feels like it's really hard to do something wrong without it telling you.
Yeah, we recently started collecting some telemetry, all anonymized, of course, but understanding if you're using Bicep, what is your failure rate versus if you're using ARM templates, what is your failure rate? And there's a little bit of a bias because, people coming to Bicep, maybe they're more advanced already and so on, but the error rate has dropped really dramatically. I think a lot more than any of us were expecting. So now it's down to around 3% because we're catching so much more in the editor. But there's, I think, still a lot of opportunity to continue to lower that rate.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that when I loaded up VS Code and you mentioned about it launching the Bicep language server. Does that mean that the fact that you've got a language server being launched, does that mean that other IDEs, for example, Rider or Visual Studio, can leverage that and get the same kind of user experience writing Bicep files in those IDEs?
Yes, you're a Rider fan, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
That was one of the first things you said to me. Is like, you got to get Rider support. Yeah, so you nailed it. So language servers, your audience may know about these well already, but we learned about them. The language server protocol is a standard specification that languages can implement, that all of these popular editors have implemented their side of it. So basically all the logic is contained in this .NET project of the language server, which is the same code as the compiler. And then to put it into VS Code, there's like a thin TypeScript layer to basically just call the language server. And that's the communication. But it's a totally self-contained package, and it can be used in other editors. We've only built support for it in VS Code, but the foundation is there to put it in any other editor. So people have put it in like NeoVim, which I didn't know was a thing. And so that's my, if it can be in NeoVim, it can run anywhere. So it was very cool to see that. And I think hopefully we'll be able to light it up in all the other editors in more of a first-class way as well.
Yeah, I guess from a .NET point of view, a similar kind of language server is OmniSharp.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing .NET in VS Code, it automatically does OmniSharp in the background, because I think that there's a C# extension, but I don't know whether that's built in or whether I've just explicitly installed it and forgotten about it. But that then launches OmniSharp in the background, which is the language server. And in the same way as you mentioned, you can do .NET in Vim and get all IntelliSense and all this kind of thing, because it's just communicating with this OmniSharp language server. And it just allows you to just leverage all these different editors, but still get that good, not IDE, but lightweight IDE experience.
Yeah, it's a really good, thorough spec. And that's why go to definition will work across editors and all those. It's all coded into the spec, and we're just implementing it. And it gives us a good list of things to do, right? It's like, if you check off all the things in the language spec, and you've pretty much done it.
That's cool. I am really looking forward to Rider support.
You can build it. I don't know what their community contribution model is for Rider, but it shouldn't be too difficult of a task, hopefully.
There's one problem with that. Time.
Yeah, right. The most precious resource.
Oh, no, no. I have to get up super early just to do things like the user group podcast. Kids as well. I should put them somewhere in the priority list.
Yeah, right. I don't have kids yet. I just have the dog, and that consumes a lot of time. So I can only imagine what it's like with kids.
I've been told having a dog is like having another child anyway, so...
From some family members, one has twins, and I have two nephews. And when I go and visit them, it's like a very good form of birth control. It's like, oh, okay, I'm not quite ready for this.
Oh, this is going to go too off tangent, so I'll keep it short, but it's life-changing, and I would not change it because I love them to bits.
That's what everybody says.
But I did not appreciate how much free time I had before.
Yeah.
I don't know what I did with all that time, honestly.
Right.
But anyway, we should probably go back on topic. So is there anything that we've not already discussed that's in the Bicep roadmap?
We talked about the module registry, which is the big one. We talked about passing resource references and kind of expanding the list of types that you have access to. That's a big one. And we did kind of touch on what we're calling Bicep extensibility, which is the ability for ARM templates or the deployment's runtime, and so Bicep benefits from this, to talk to other sets of APIs besides ARM APIs. And so we'll be able to talk to Microsoft Graph, we'll be able to talk to like Kubernetes, and we can expand the list from there, but we want to start with a small list and make sure it's working as expected.
Very cool. So before we move on to dev tips, is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Oh, we should talk about .NET and the .NET Renaissance and how much it has helped the Bicep project. Can we talk about that?
We can. How many hours do we have?
Right. I mean, so my like view into the .NET world was so naive, and it's still extremely naive. But like, I built a website for my mom in ASP.NET, and that was my exposure to .NET. And I was like, I don't think I want to do this anymore. I want to use one of the cool new web frameworks and do more JavaScript. And so I had like written it off. And then when we were starting the Bicep project, we spent a lot of time evaluating what language are we going to use. All of our engineers are extremely familiar with .NET. Most of our backend services are written in .NET. But there was this like lingering problem of like, we don't want to have to have everybody install the .NET runtime and go through all of this stuff. And then, one, obviously .NET now runs cross OS, so that wasn't an issue. But two, this single file executable magic that you guys now have in .NET totally made the project realistic, because it allowed all of our engineers to use the language that they were most familiar with, but still make a native binary that made installing the CLI trivially easy. And so I've just been totally blown away by the .NET ecosystem and the variety of options that you have at your disposal. And like, nobody knows that we're using .NET. It's not like a thing that we have to explain to people. It all just works. So that's been magical, and that's been my experience with .NET.
Yeah, it's scary how fast .NET is evolving. And it's getting more so because you mentioned that it's cross-platform. So like .NET can run anywhere, including on your watch. It's going to be like on IoT devices, Windows, Linux, Mac. But it's not just about the operating system. It's also about the platform. So you can do websites in .NET. You can do desktop applications in .NET. Like you've got Xamarin, which is now being rebranded as .NET MAUI. Mm-hmm. You've got Blazor, so you can do front end in the browser. So you mentioned React earlier, but Blazor is kind of like an alternative to React Angular Vue, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Using WebAssembly actually just running it in the browser, you can run .NET in the browser as well. Blazor desktop, you can do cross-platform desktop applications using Blazor components. So the same kind of programming model as you do websites. In experimental form, there's Blazor mobile. So using the same paradigm of coding, you might be able to do mobile applications.
Right.
And this new .NET MAUI, which is kind of like XAML, the same as WPF, that kind of thing. But you can also embed Blazor components in that as well. So you can have kind of a hybrid kind of mix. So it's kind of like cross-platform. It's open source, as you mentioned. It's been open source for quite a long time. But I think a lot of people outside the .NET space still don't even know that.
Right.
Don't know that it's cross-platform, don't know that it's open source, let alone this new stuff I've just been talking about.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me to have such a mature ecosystem, still have so much unbelievable opportunity in front of it. And like all the foundational pieces are being set up correctly to just like unleash .NET onto the world, and all the tooling's there and the community's there and the ecosystem's there. And so it's just amazing. I continue to be blown away by it.
Yeah, it's definitely a good time to be a .NET developer.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So, shall we do dev tips?
Sure. Should I just go?
Go for it.
Okay. I think I was thinking about it. So, I mean, I'm a lowly PM. I just make PowerPoints and Word documents all day, and I never really develop outside of, I spend a lot of time developing Bicep code at this point. But I guess my tip for someone like me, or for maybe anybody, is like to really get your hands dirty on all of the like the world, like the amount of options that are out there for doing everything, and trying to be empathetic with where people are coming from and what frameworks they're using and all that sort of stuff. Just like do your best to kick the tires with all these really weird and wacky alternatives for doing all these things. I worked like a little bit on a startup at one point. It didn't end up going anywhere, but I was able to do like real like boots on the ground front end web development and work closely with a back end engineer, and that totally taught me for real what my engineers are doing every day. And I was able to be way more empathetic, and I think communicate more effectively with them by really understanding what's going on back there. So to the extent that you can get out of your comfort zone and try something that maybe your stakeholders care about but you don't care about, try to do those things.
I really like the phrase you used then about getting your hands dirty, because a talk that I did quite a few years ago on developer productivity, one of the sections I was talking about learning, and I was comparing a developer that's been developing for 20, 25 years for the same company, writing the same code base, doing the same day for 20 years. And if you compare that developer with a developer that's only been developing for 2 years, but plays around with different technologies, has hobby projects, does lots of reading, books, blog posts, Pluralsight courses, listen to podcasts, and just plays with different technologies, learns different paradigms. That 2 year developer is way more experienced than that 20-year developer. And it's just so important to just play around and learn, and not just do what your day job demands, which for a lot of people is the same day in, day out.
Right. And I think, I do want to be sensitive to like not everyone has the luxury of time to be able to, do a weekend project or here and there. And I think I'm very lucky at Microsoft. They offer us time just to learn. So a regular day of the week when we can try something new. So we carve out time for it, which is really, really something. But you're exactly right. I mean, if you can try to get out of your comfort zone and make the time for it, it opens up the world to you. You just see a lot of different ways of doing things that you hadn't even considered.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right to call me up on that, because it's true that a lot of people don't have the time. And if there's anyone that's a business owner that's listening, also take that point that what Alex made about giving your staff time to actually learn, because your employees will be happier
Yeah.
because they're learning new stuff. So they're less likely to move on and find somewhere else. And they'll be better developers. So you will have a better quality of code being produced.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, 100%.
So my dev tip is another Visual Studio Code extension, and this one's called Code Tour. Now, I've heard about this a few times, but I got prompted to relook at it after hearing about it on the Merge Conflict podcast, which I will link to that episode in the show notes, because obviously credit where credit's due. I had a play around with this morning, actually. And so it's a VS Code extension, which you can click a button saying start recording, and you can click on a particular line of code and you get an overlay where you can type in a comment, and then you're basically adding a step to the tour. And this takes markdown, so you can put code snippets if you want in there, or a general discussion. And then once you add that step to the tour, you can then click on another bit of your code and do the same again until you've gone through effectively creating a wizard, so a code tour, explaining new developers that are coming to your code base how it works. And then this gets stored as a JSON file, which you can put in your Git repository, and they can go and then they can treat it like a wizard. So it's almost documenting like a story, click next, and they're being talked through how the code base works. And I thought this was a really nice idea. So I'm going to start using it for a few of my projects.
Nice. Did you go through the end-to-end and set up a tutorial?
A lot of my playing around was adding new step to tour, randomly hitting keys on the keyboard, add step, find another random bit of code, just because I was playing around with it. But I was kind of like trying to picture what it would be like if I was doing it. But I've not yet actually done like a real live tutorial, but I'll definitely will be doing.
Nice.
And so I'll include a link to this in the show notes. But I thought it was just a really nice idea and a really nice way of introducing new developers to a code base and giving them a tour.
Yeah, it's so cool. Someone shared it with us, and we have this exact problem, and we actually just recently added 4 new maintainers to the Bicep project, and they have this exact problem, right? They want to know about the project, they want to contribute more, and so we're now thinking about adding a code tour. So it is a very cool tool for sure.
And that's a good point, because you mentioned earlier that Bicep was open source. So this sounds ideal for open source projects where you want people to get involved and help, but you don't have the time to teach ongoingly, answer lots of questions. It's just a really good way of documenting as a story.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So where's the best place for listeners to learn more about Bicep, reach out to you?
So there's like a Bicep hub on Microsoft Docs right now. So if you search Bicep MS Docs, you'll reach our documentation hub. You can go to the repo where you can file issues and really get kind of deeper into the Bicep community. So github.com/Azure/Bicep. We have a Twitter account for Bicep. It's @BicepLang. And if you want to reach me specifically, it's a.frank on Twitter is a good way to reach me as well.
And I can say that from past experience, you've been super fast at replying to Twitter DMs and things.
Yeah, I love that, because then it's hard to get people who are like really in the thick of it. And so when you or anyone else comes to me with like, here's exactly what I'm doing, here's the code, please help. It's really, I always learn a lot from that process, as I did with what you shared with us. And we actually got an improvement done, which is like a miracle in Azure. So it worked, which is very nice.
I really enjoyed that. So for the listeners' benefit, there was an issue I was getting, and it wasn't actually a Bicep issue. It was more an app service issue. It was like you probably had the same thing with ARM templates. So I brought this up with Alex, and then after a bit of backwards and forwarding, we ended up having a call with the Microsoft team that are actually working on the app service. You can say better who was in the meeting. But for me, it was kind of a bit surreal and almost a bit of imposter syndrome, because I'm in a call explaining the issue and sharing my screen and showing code and explaining what I thought the problem was with the engineers that are actually working on Azure App Service. So that was quite surreal for me.
Nice. Yeah. And one is, we're not all one team. So when you have an Azure problem, it's usually across 5 or 6 different teams for any given problem. So it's helpful to get all of us in the room together. And 2, there are so many different touch points to the experiences that we're providing, to the APIs that we're putting out into the world. So there are endless like enumerations and combinations of ways that you can interact with App Service or Key Vault or you name it. And so when you come to us, it's definitely not imposter syndrome. It's really, I went through this path, and maybe the App Service team didn't see this exact path before. And so it really does help us ground ourselves and understand, okay, we thought it was going to be used this way, but it's actually being used that way. How can we adjust accordingly and make it work?
That's really awesome. So is there anything else before we wrap up that you want to mention?
No, this was an awesome experience.
I think we've covered an awful lot. So a really big thank you, Alex, for joining us. It's been amazing having you on.
Thank you again for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, you're most welcome. And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter @Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And as usual, we will include links to all the things we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.